Picking the best standard zoom lens for full-frame Sony cameras. Let's go! What's good guys, my name is Oleg Nikitin, you're watching No Limits On channel. So today we're having a look at 6 different lenses at about 24 to 70-ish focal range. Of course guys, I cannot review all of the Sony 24 to 70-ish lenses, but in the end of the video I'll cover the honorable mentions and tell you about the drawbacks and the benefits of those lenses that are not in this particular review. But first guys, a little disclaimer about how all the tests were done. I used the Sony ZV-E1 camera with the Sony a7S III or FX3 sensor. I had the same settings, the same white balance setting, the same aperture, or if the aperture is different, I was using the shutter speed and I was adjusting the exposure to the same amount of stops. And also during the post-processing I was applying exactly the same color correction to all of the lenses. And also guys, I've made a ton of comparison charts, like 6 lenses all side by side, and I have uploaded to a cloud all 26 of those little charts, so you can download the screenshots, the 4K screenshots, and pixel peep without really adjusting to my pace, so you'll be able to do it in a really nice fashion at your biggest and nicest screen. And of course guys, right now, pick up the 4K quality, use your biggest and best screen possible, let's go. So guys, right now I'm gonna be looking at my 5K display, 27-inch, so I can pixel peep a little bit. So let's have a look at the first image, and this is the difference between 28mm, 24mm and 20mm, because these are the widest angles of those 6 lenses, the participants. So the 20mm and 28mm is a huge difference, but even the 24 and the 20mm is a pretty dramatic difference in my opinion, so you can really understand the difference in this image with the red, blue and the natural image. So here we have the minimum focal length of all lenses. So our participants are the Sony 20-70 f4G lens, 24-70 G Master f2.8 Mark II, 24-105, and now you can see the maximum focal length of all of those lenses, f4 with a stabilization built in, Tamron 20-40, Sigma 28-70 f2.8, and also the Tamron 28-75 G2 lens. Now we're at the widest setting, you can have a look at the distortion of this lens, and at 20mm I don't see major issues with the distortion, and the same applies to 70mm of the 20-70 f4 lens, which I also have right here in my hands. So now let's move on to 24-70 G Master lens. I do see a little bit of the barrel distortion. You can have a look at the building at the left and at the light poles on the right. And at 70mm, we do have a little bit of pincushion distortion. And by the way, all the tests were made with the in-camera corrections turned on. So the chromatic aberration, vignette, distortion correction, it's all on all 6 lenses. Right now we are looking at 24-105 lens. At 24mm, no major issues with the distortion, and at 105 we can see how far we can zoom in and no real issues with the distortion as well. Pretty great performance by the Sony. So the Tamron 20-40 lens, you can see that it has a little bit of barrel distortion at 20mm, and then we can zoom in 2 times to 40mm, but here we have pretty noticeable pincushion distortion. You can see how the building on the left is kind of bending a little bit. So now let's move on to Sigma 28-70 f2.8, and I can see straight away the barrel distortion of this lens at 28mm, but when we zoom into 70mm, we have a huge pincushion distortion. So this lens is not the best if you plan on filming architecture or something like real estate. And the final lens in the list is the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 G2, and we have pretty okay distortion at 28mm, no major issues whatsoever. And then we'll go to 75mm and we see a pretty huge pincushion distortion, which is a bit irritating, at least to me. So now let's move on to a different test, also comparing the focal length. So here we have a studio setting with the same lighting, so the light doesn't change. You can see the different colors of the lenses, and here is the 20-70 wide open at f4, and you can see how wide we get with this 20 compared to 24-70 f2.8 G Master. You can also check the sharpness of the lens, the skin tone of the lens, 24-105, here it is. And also let's move on to Tamron 20-40 f2.8. It's a bit on the softer side of things, it's not as sharp as the G Master lens for sure, the Sigma 28-70. The 28 is pretty tight, to be honest. And now let's move on to the Tamron 28-75. It looks not that bad, to be honest. Now let's move on to the tightest focal length, the maximum focal length. So here is the 20-70 f4 lens, pretty sharp one. The G Master lens also looks great, the skin tone is nice. Now we have the 24-105 at 105, and you can see how tight it is, and a lot of bokeh as well, no matter it's an f4 lens. The 20-40 is nothing special here. The 70mm on the Sigma looking pretty nice, and the 75mm on the Tamron, also really nice bokeh. And by the way guys, why did I pick the Tamron 20-40mm? Because it's really far from the 70mm range. Because I have my 20-70 f4 Sony G lens, and I wanted to compare it to another 20mm lens but with f2.8, and for this particular reason the Tamron 20-40 f2.8 was a perfect match. Now guys, we're having a look at the autofocus performance. All lenses are at the widest aperture, wide open, and at 35mm, so they all have around 35mm focal length, and we test the autofocus. It's hard to understand at 6 frames like so let me show you the one by one examples. So the 20-70 f4 G lens, it has dual linear motors for autofocus, and I see zero issues with this lens. Great performance. Now let's have a look at a different lens, a much more expensive one. This is the 24-70 f2.8 G Master Mark II. And as you can see guys, it's simply perfect. Also dual linear motors for autofocus in this lens, and it's simply flawless. Now let's have a look at a more older lens, 24-105 f4. And it is older, but it doesn't mean that it is worse. I can see a slight difference between those two lenses, the first place and the 24-105, but still it's like A-, let me say, A- mark for the autofocus. The 20-40 f2.8 from Tamron, it is a bit slower when it focuses on the background, and I see that it breathes a little bit in terms of autofocus, but still it's like B+, A-, let me say. Pretty good one. 28-70 f2.8 from Sigma, no major issues as far as I see. Right here I saw some, breathing of the autofocus. It wasn't perfect, but let me say it's a B+ mark for the Sigma. And now the Tamron lens, 28-75 f2.8 G lens. It's super fast. All the settings are set to the maximum, so the maximum speed and sensitivity of the autofocus. Yeah, it does great. So now guys, let's have a look at the flares performance. Now we're at the minimum focal length of all 6 lenses. And let me say that only the Sigma 28-70 has a real issue because we had a little scratch on the lens, so don't be too strict about this lens. So the 20-70 at 20mm handles the backlight really well, no major issues with flares. The 24-70 G Master does have a little bit less contrast and more flares, which is surprising to me. So the 24-105 lens handles the backlight at 24mm pretty well. We see only a little issue towards the edge of the shot. And then the Tamron 20-40 lens, we see a pretty big loss of contrast, let me say, but all in all, it's pretty average performance, let me say. The Sigma 28-70, it handles it really good, but this little flare is from the scratch, so don't judge it. And also the Tamron 28-75 handles it not really bad, but we see a loss of contrast as well. So now let's move on to the maximum focal length. And as you can tell guys, we have pretty dramatic difference in terms of the 105-70mm. So if you do need the closer, tighter look, you need to use the 105 lens for sure, or get simply closer. So the 20-70 f4 handles the backlighting pretty well. The G Master actually has bigger loss of contrast, maybe because of a bigger front element. Then the 24-105, it really struggles in backlighting situations, and we have a pretty dramatic loss of contrast right here. The 20-40 at 40mm from Tamron, a huge loss of contrast, so it doesn't handle backlighting situations really well. The Sigma 28-70, so probably this flare is from the scratch, so don't judge it once again. And then let's have a look at the Tamron 28-75. Loss of contrast is pretty big, but nothing too serious. Let me say none of those lenses have too big of an issue with the flares and the backlighting situations, so let's move on. So right now, guys, we're looking at the minimum focus and distance at the minimum focal length for all 6 lenses, and let me say that the 20-70 f4 and especially the 24-105 f4 are really struggling with the minimum focus and distance at the wide end. But the Tamrons and the Sigma do really great. Also the G Master looks pretty fine to me, and we're wide open. We can see some chromatic aberrations, especially on the Tamron lenses and the Sigma, but when we stop down to f5.6, we get really great sharpness on all 6 lenses, and also we do have not a lot of chromatic aberrations, which we had before, especially on the non-Sony lenses. Now let's have a look at more traditional macro length of the maximum focal length of all 6 lenses, and here we can see that the Sony 20-70 is getting the best result, and I do prefer the tighter focal length when I shoot macro, because all macro lenses are like 90mm, 100mm, and it's more appropriate to film macro because we have more adequate proportions, let me say. The Tamron 20-40 and the Sigma 28-70 have okay results, and the Sony 24-70 G Master, the 24-105 and the Tamron 28-75 have okay results, a bit better than the Sigma and the Tamron on the lower left part of the image. But all in all, the 20-70 f4 from Sony, this one, shows great results, and I do like this ability to film macro at 70mm with this lens. Now let's close down the aperture to f5.6 to get rid of the chromatic aberrations. We see pretty big chromatic aberrations in the Sigma lens, but when we stop down, it gets really nice and much better. So you do need to stop down if you film at minimum focus and distance, or if you take photos at the minimum focus and distance to get the best results. So now we're looking at the bokeh at the minimum focal length of all 6 lenses, and I'm standing in exactly the same spot, around 1 meter away, 1.5 meters away from the lenses. Now we're at 35mm on all 6 lenses, guys. And now let's have a look at the tightest focal length, and you can see that the 24-105 gives you more background separation because of the focal length. Now let's have each lens at 35mm. Wide open, so the 35mm at 20-70 f4, you do get some background separation even at f4. The G Master lens, you get a lot more background separation, not a lot to be honest, but more. Also the 24-105, the bokehs look pretty nice to me, a bit busy to be honest. Then the Tamron 20-40 lens, it's okay, but it lacks contrast to be honest, and it's really bothering me. The Sigma, pretty good bokeh, to be honest, nothing too crazy. And then the Tamron at 35mm as well. Pretty nice bokeh as well, no complaints whatsoever. Now let's have a look at the tightest focal length. So at 20-70 f4, we do have pretty nice background separation when we film like a breast shot. Then the G Master lens, a bit more bokeh, but it's not a huge difference to be honest, because here you can see that at 105 at f4, we get even more background separation because of the focal length. So here is the Tamron 20-40 at 40mm, not really special, but it's fine. You can get some background separation. The Sigma at 70mm looks really good, the bokeh is not busy, pretty creamy let me say, and the Tamron at 75mm, also really nice and creamy, good bokeh. So now we're having a look at the chromatic aberrations at 200% scale at 35mm and wide open for each lens. 20-70, great performance. Let me say this lens is apochromatic. I don't see a single chromatic aberration right here. The 24-70 G Master does have some chromatic aberrations and is showing worse performance than the 20-70, to my surprise. The 24-105 looks pretty much great, a little bit of chromatic aberrations, but nothing too crazy. The Tamron 20-40 does have major issues with chromatic aberrations, and I would suggest stopping down if you want to reduce those. The Sigma 28-70 also shows not the best performance. I do see a lot of purple and green tints on the contrast edges, and the Tamron 28-75 is fine. Let me say it's an average performance, but it's not really that bad as the Sigma lens. And of course, guys, since I've purchased the 20-70 f4 lens, I needed a new ND filter because this has 72mm filter thread and all of my ND filters are 67mm. So I've purchased this filter. It's called Nisi True Color. I'm not sure if it focuses. Come on, focus. Thank you. So it comes in this really nice carrying case. Let me show you the box of this filter. So it does have 1 to 5 stops of ND, which is plenty for the f4 lens, even at the bright sunny day. If you film at 1/50th shutter and an f4, the 5 stops are more than fine. But it also has an extra filter, which simply stacks on top, and now you get 6 to 9 stops. And it means that you can use something like f1.4 lenses outdoors on a sunny day using only this filter, and it also becomes a variable but with a stronger stop of ND. So highly recommend those. Let me show you a couple of examples with those filters. And of course, guys, all the tests were done without any filters, no NDs, no UVs, nothing. So the optical quality of the lens is pure, and we used the shorter shutter speeds when we did the outdoor tests. So let's have a look. So here we have the Nisi filter set to 1 stop, and now we rotate it to become 5 stop filter. So here you go. You have 1 to 5 stops outdoors. It's enough to film at f4, as you saw. So here is the difference with and without a filter. I can see a very slight magenta shift on the Nisi filter, but it's like super minimal and it won't bother you in post. So now let's have a look at the image without a filter and then with 5 stops applied. And as you can tell, guys, the difference is simply huge. So if you do need a good filter, I do recommend you using the Nisi True Color filters and this particular model. So now let's move on to the stabilization test. I did my best ninja walk with all 6 lenses, and now let's have a look at all 6 of them side by side. Steady shot active, 28mm on all lenses, and the top 3 portions, the Sony lenses, are much more stable, at least to my eye, than the lower 3 images with non-Sony lenses, non-native lenses. And also the 24-105 f4 OSS on the top right doesn't appear to be much smoother than the 24-70 f2.8 G Master. So the OSS in the 24-105 is great when your camera doesn't have the IBIS system, for instance the Sony FX6. But if your camera does have IBIS, you don't have major benefits of using the OSS lens, at least from those examples when you're walking really slowly and using steady shot active. You can also dial in the settings of the steady shot manually, and here's the example, the Sigma 28-70 with steady shot set to auto, so the camera decides which focal length it's using, and then the same Sigma but with manually set to 28mm IBIS settings, and it should be better with the manually set to 28mm, but guys, as you can tell, there is not a huge difference, maybe there is no difference whatsoever. It's still a bit shaky compared to the native Sony lenses. But when I had my Viltrox 28mm f1.8 prime lens set to automatic steady shot setting, it was super shaky. Then I set it to 28mm manually and it was much more stable. But for zoom lenses anyway, it is not possible to set the focal length for your steady shot at all times. So you want to film at 28, then at 40mm, then at 70mm, and you won't be changing the steady shot setting all the time. So in this particular case, the Sony lenses are better. I'm not sure why it is like so. Maybe Sony reduces the performance of the steady shot with non-Sony lenses, who knows? But still, if you care about stabilization and you do have the IBIS in your camera, the Sony native lenses are a better choice. So we also had a different Sony lens, the 7th lens, the 24-70 f4 Sony Zeiss lens with OSS at the left, and then the 20-70 f4 with no image stabilization on the right. And I can tell there is a little bit of difference using the OSS, but it's not dramatic and huge, so don't pick a lens simply for the OSS, especially if your camera does have the built-in image stabilization like IBIS system. And now guys, we're looking at the widest angle of each lens, wide open, and the center sharpness at 150%. And as you can tell, they are more or less the same. The contrast differs a little bit, so you can download those screenshots through the link that I've said before and simply pixel pip yourself. So now let's have a look at the corner of the shot at 200% scale and wide open minimal focal length. So here we can see that the Sony 20-70 and the G Master are showing the best performance. The 24-105 is a bit worse than the Tamron, and the Tamron 20-40 and Sigma 28-70 are showing really bad results. So here is the f4, we have better vignette performance, a little bit more sharpness on the lower 3 lenses, but all in all, it's still not the greatest performance I've seen. And now f5.6, here it is, and it is getting more or less sharp to f5.6, but still the best performances from top two Sony lenses, 20-70 and 24-70 lenses. So now guys, let's have a look at 28mm. All 6 lenses are at 28mm, they all have this focal length, and here you can see the difference in contrast, but the sharpness is more or less comparable between those lenses in the middle of the image. But what if we get to the corner of the image? Here I can straight away say that the 24-70 G Master is the best one, 20-70 is on the second place, the 24-105 on the third place, the Tamron 28-75 the fifth place or the fourth place, and the Tamron 20-40 and Sigma 28-70, they have simply super soft corners at 28mm wide open, so it's not the best performance. The chromatic aberrations are also apparent, and the huge vignette on the Sigma in the corner. So let's step down to f4, and at f4 we can see some improvements in terms of the vignette on the Sigma, and the sharpness also improves a little bit, but still it's a pretty soft result, especially considering that we're filming in 4K only. It's not a 33 megapixel image, not a 50 megapixel image, but still you can see that the results are really obvious, and if you need the best sharpness performance, step down to at least f5.6, and still the G Master and the Sony 20-70 are going to be a lot sharper than all other 4 lenses. So now let's have a look at the maximum focal length, wide open, scale 150%. Straight away I can see that the Sigma 28-70 is not the sharpest one. By the way, I was setting the focus manually with pixel peeping like at the highest level with 4x magnification on my Atomos Ninja 5, so it's not an autofocus issue, I was focusing super precisely. And also we can see the difference in contrast wide open with those lenses at maximum focal length. Now let's have a look at the corner to 100% scale. We can straight away tell that the 24-70 G Master is doing great. The 20-70 f4 also looks nice. The 24-105 is not really bad. And also the 28-75 Tamron shows great performance, but I do see some chromatic aberrations at 75mm wide open. But the Tamron 20-40 and the Sigma lens is simply showing a pretty poor performance, to be honest, guys. A lot of vignette, super soft corners, and not a lot of contrast in Tamron, especially the 20-40. So if you plan on filming at tightest focal length, you have to stop down to at least f4, even f5.6 to get better results. So here we are at f4, good performance by 4 lenses, 3 lenses on top, and the Tamron 28-75, but the Sigma 28-70 is still pretty soft at f4, and the Tamron 20-40 is simply super soft at f4. Now let's step down even further to f5.6 to get the maximum. So the 24-105 gets a boost in terms of the vignette, it gets lost almost. The 28-75 now looks pretty much great, the Tamron. And we still have some chromatic aberrations, unfortunately. The Sigma becomes to look at least usable in the corner, but the Tamron 20-40 is still not great, not great, guys, to be honest. So now let's move on to the focus breathing test. With Sony lenses, you do have the focus breathing compensation, but I have turned it off for this test. So here we have the results. We see a slight focus breathing on the Sony 20-70, an okay focus breathing on the G Master, almost no focus breathing on the 24-105. Tamron 20-40 at the minimal focal length breathes a lot, you have to keep that in mind at all times. The Sigma shows average performance, and the Tamron almost doesn't have focus breathing, which is nice. At the maximum focal length, we do see that only the Tamron 20-40 struggles a lot, but all in all, maybe the G Master also does have some problems. But keep in mind, guys, that for Sony lenses, you simply turn on the focus breathing compensation and you have zero focus breathing, whereas with the third-party lenses, you just cannot turn it on. It doesn't work with third-party lenses. Also, guys, the lenses differ in terms of features and buttons. So for instance, this 20-70 f4 lens, which I own, has 2 customizable buttons right here. Also the MF-AF switch, the focus ring, the zoom ring, the iris lock mechanism, the ring for adjusting your aperture from the lens itself with clicks or without the clicks. Also the weather sealing on the bottom of the lens and throughout the whole lens. And you gotta keep that in mind when choosing a lens. If you use those functions, for instance, the custom button is a really nice option because you can actually assign a ton of functions to it, and I use it all the time for MF-AF switch for a fast movement, or I can just adjust the focus with the manual ring using the feature that is called focus adjustment. While autofocusing, I can manually tweak the focus and it will refocus and continue the autofocus, or adjusting the aperture while filming a video, going from the dark place to a brighter space or something like this. So you gotta keep that in mind as well. And for instance, the Tamron 28-75 has the one customizable button and also a USB Type-C port for updates. The Tamron 20-40mm only has the zoom ring and the focusing ring. The Sigma is also pretty straightforward, so in this regard the native Sony lenses have more features, more buttons, more control elements. Also guys, keep in mind that the native Sony lenses are better than the third-party lenses in few nuances. For instance, it does have the focus breathing compensation with only Sony native lenses. Also, the stabilization is better with native Sony lenses. Also, the autofocus has its maximum potential, and if you do take a lot of stills, for instance with the Sony A1, if you want to shoot at 30 frames per second, you need to use a fast native Sony lens like the GM Mark II 24-70, because the Tamron 28-75 won't allow you to make 30 frames per second in stills. You can only make like 15 frames per second with a third-party lens. You gotta keep that in mind as well. Why do I need the 24-70-ish lens, and why do you need such a lens? So the first thing is that you only want to own one lens and to use one lens. The 24-70 is kinda makes sense. It makes sense, guys. So I use my 20-70 lens mainly to film repertoire style shoots, different events, wedding venues and all that stuff. But if I want some shallow depth of field, or if I want to film in low light, I do have the 85mm f1.8 and the 28mm f1.8 lenses. So if you do need kind of creative shots or low light performance, you'd better pick at least one fixed lens, which can be the 35 f1.8 FE, for instance, from Sony. And it will cover a huge range of focal length with one zoom lens, and also the creative freedom and the low light performance of a fixed lens. This is my suggestion, but I won't use the 20-70 to all of my creative shots, maybe some creative shots during the wedding day, but not all of them. So that is why, guys, I do suggest using the zoom lens as a repertoire style lens and the fixed lenses for different style of interviews where you don't need a lot of movement with the focal length and all that stuff. And guys, in the beginning of the video I promised you to say a few words about the honorable mentions, and the first lens that comes to my mind is the Sigma 24-70 f2.8. It's a great lens. I didn't have a chance to test it alongside those 6 lenses, but still it's a pretty sharp lens, really nice bokeh, but two things really irritate me with this lens. The first one being the size and weight. It's a super giant lens, to be honest, and the second one is that it's not a native Sony lens and the stabilization is going to be a bit worse, and I love using my 24-70-ish lenses handheld while filming some repertoire style shoots. So the second lens is the Samyang 24-70 f2.8. It's even bigger and bulkier, and I took this lens for a review and I didn't like it at all and didn't even make a review for that reason, so this is no-go for me. Then we have the new one, the 24-50 f2.8G lens from Sony. It's a nice lens, of course it is, but 24-50 is kind of limiting, at least to me. I would rather buy the 20-70 f4G lens, because I do think that this focal range distance and difference is really significant. So the next one is the classic Sony Zeiss 24-70 f4 with optical stabilization. I did have this lens. This lens was stolen from me in Italy back in May 2023. And I did enjoy using this lens, but it's an older lens, has worse optical performance than the 20-70 f4G, and also it's not super feature rich, let me say. I do have a comparison of it with the G Master Mark II 24-70. Oh no, it's a decent lens, but I would pick a newer one, the 20-70, instead of that one, because the optical image stabilization didn't do a lot with the 24-70 Zeiss lens. So another one is the Tamron 17-50 f4. It's a nice focal range, but guys, one of my favorite YouTubers, Christopher Frost, did a review of this lens, and basically this lens has really poor optical performance and it really disappointed me, so I would not recommend you picking this one up. I didn't try one myself, but I do believe to Christopher, I do believe Chris. So Chris, hi to you if you're watching. Who knows, maybe he is. And then we have one of my favorite travel zoom lenses, the Tamron 28-200mm f2.8 to f5.6, which is a great range, but it has changeable aperture, so it changes while you're zooming. It's a great lens, pretty compact, 28mm at f2.8, pretty nice compression at 200mm. Weather sealing, also great macro capabilities, nice lens, but only if you are okay with the aperture that changes while you're zooming, which is not really ideal for me and my type of work. But this lens is really worth consideration. And the last one is the pretty old one, Sony 24 to 240mm f3.5 to 6.3. This lens is optically not the greatest. It's pretty soft, wide open, and also it has the aperture which is changing throughout the focal range, but the focal range is great, so you might consider this one, but I would pick the 20 to 70 anyway, because I simply don't need this far reach, and optically that lens is not perfect. So guys, why did I purchase the 20 to 70mm f4G lens? Because I had the 24 to 70 Zeiss lens previously, and I was really satisfied with the f4 for my reportage style shoots, no issues whatsoever. f2.8 is only one stop brighter, so instead of 6400 ISO, I would use 12800 ISO, and since I'm using the ZV-E1, I have really nice high ISO performance, so f4 is pretty fine for me. The bokeh and the background separation is also pretty okay, especially at 70mm. If I want to have some background blur, I'll just come closer to my subject. Also, at 70mm, it has a macro capabilities, as you saw before. It's super sharp, wide open at all focal length, also as you saw from my test charts. And 20mm on the full frame camera makes me not want to buy an ultra-wide lens. I'm pretty fine with 20mm for real estate, for architecture style, and for reportage it's a great thing, because when I enable the active steady shots, I do have 1.1 crop, and it makes it a 22mm lens. Or if I want to add something like dynamic active stabilization, which adds a 30% crop, it becomes a 26mm lens, but with crazy good stabilization. And all in all, this lens is super versatile, has a lot of control elements, functions, really nice and lightweight, less than half a kilogram. It extends at 70mm, but you can balance it on a DJI Ronin S, for instance, no issues whatsoever. So to me, it's a workhorse, super simple and versatile lens that just gets me covered in all of my life situations during different shoots, and simply recommend it a lot. And guys, a few words about the size and weight of those lenses. So the lightest one is obviously the 20 to 40 from Tamron, it's less than 400 grams. Then we have three lenses around 500 grams, the 20 to 70 f4, the Tamron 28 to 75, and also the Sigma 28 to 70, around 500 grams. Then we have two bigger brothers, it's 24 to 105 and the GM lens, around 600 and 700 grams respectively. And the 24 to 105, when extended, and the GM lens as well, they get pretty bulky. And also the pricing. So the Tamron 20 to 40 costs $700, and close to it we have the Sigma, which is $750. But to be honest, guys, those two lenses are the least attractive, at least to me, from my tests. So I did all the tests, and those two lenses were the worst in my opinion. So then we have around $1,000 mark, and this is the Tamron 28 to 75, the Sony 20 to 70, and the Sony 24 to 105. $900, $1,100, and $1,200 respectively. So I would pay extra from the Tamron to the Sony lenses. To be honest, that I don't mind that they are f4. This is my personal preference. And then we have the GM lens, which is $2,300. And I cannot simply justify this high price for this lens. At least to me, I would rather buy this one and another lens instead of a 24 to 70 GM Mark II. To conclude, guys, you saw the results, you saw all of my tests, and the main thing is that you need to pick a lens according to your particular needs and your shooting scenarios. You need to decide whether you need an f4 lens or an f2.8 lens, whether you need to film from a gimbal or static shots most of the time, or reportage style shoots or handheld, and just depending on your needs, guys, because there is no such thing as the perfect lens and the perfect lens for the money as well. So I did pick my own 24 to 70-ish lens. This is the 20 to 70 f4 lens, but you can pick a completely different one depending on your particular needs. So guys, thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, please smash the like and subscribe buttons and hit the notifications bell. It's been a lot of work, to be honest, so here I have a next video for you to watch. This is the how to pick a good lens and do not regret. A lot of data about picking a right lens, what it does, what it doesn't, focus breathing, flaring, chromatic aberrations, distortion, vignetting, sharpness, etc, etc, etc. So go watch that video next. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Take care. Bye.